was in the Garden of Eden. They must have shook that thing. Well, the leaves started falling, the snake started crawling. He must have give her a diamond ring. Adam said to Eve, you just won't wait till I get out of this garden gate. When Adam and Eve
So I grew up a pastor's kid, and my dad was the pastor. And we were in central Wisconsin at a church that, small town, but it was like a large church for the area. So I grew up with everything that would be like a classic evangelical, Pentecostal, charismatic language about God. And we had the full like tongue talking thing. I think I started speaking in tongues when I was 3 years old, which just means like noises of, they taught the 3-year-olds how to robo type thing. And then in middle school, we moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, because my parents were going to start a church in Tulsa. Like Tulsa needed more churches. They felt like God told them to start a church in Tulsa. So we moved to Tulsa, and about 3 years in or 2 years into this church, my dad had an affair, and it came out. And our lives were like, from that moment on, just flipped upside down. Our worlds were flipped upside down. Because we were at a large, fast-growing church, and I was in a Christian public school, and everyone knew my last name. And so then it was like scandal with a name. But then in middle school through kind of high school, I was a part of a Christian school, and then I went to public school for the first time in high school, because I'd always gone to like Christian private schools. And so then it was the first time like actually learning real science, like about like evolution and those things. And I remember like probably at a young age, I started to like kind of have a deconstruction of my Wisconsin childhood to then like Tulsa, Oklahoma view on God. Everything started through that trauma flipping upside down. And then my parents, they'd stayed together, kind of a crazy story of restoration for them. And our family became quite close. And then they started another church. And that church had a bend more towards the liturgical. My dad was originally Catholic, and then was like a Jesus people guy in the late 60s, early 70s. And then in like the Catholic charismatic movement. Then he went to Rhema in the 70s, and then ORU and the whole like Pentecostal scene. Sure. So he then went back towards like the historical church. And at that time, I was introduced to a more like Anglican view of faith, and that like when I was probably like 17 or 18, I started reading like N.T. Wright, and I was introduced to Henry Nouwen, and I like loved everything ever by Henry Nouwen, because he had a way of speaking to the heart like a good evangelical kid wanted to hear. However, a totally different framework as a Catholic as far as like the language that he used. And so it kind of captured my imagination, and I started to go into a more sacramental language of faith. However, it was just like growing. And I went, graduated high school early. I was playing music with my brother Michael. I was playing bass. We were playing like a choir of the fire, large arena, like you need to know Jesus, get him inside of your heart, like evangelical language. That then, at that time, I think we were just like young Christian rock stars, or we thought we were, because we were playing to like thousands of people, and it was really cool. I had hair back then, and like just felt so good. And then I got a job at a mega church leading worship as a generational worship pastor.
That was the title?
Yeah, oh yeah. And then from there, it's again, my family was friends with, out of all people, Ted Haggard, and everything that happened with that guy, which is a whole nother, you can Google that shit, that is crazy. Then after Haggard, I had another boss that had an affair. And then at the same church, another like mentor type guy. So during that time, I was a worship leader, but then started down the path of like becoming a youth pastor.
Wow.
And so I trained under one of their pastors there that would bring me to like the hospital for hospital visits. He would wear a suit every time we went to the hospital, and he'd pray for people and just be present. And because I was like loved Henry Nouwen, like this guy to me was like my Pentecostal Henry Nouwen, because it's just, he was always present with people who were in pain. So I was really drawn to the idea of maybe I think I'll be a pastor. And then I got married like any evangelical kid would at like 20 years old, because I wanted to have sex. And I had a V card. It's very tattered but laminated, you know, with the Holy Spirit. And we then moved. We got pregnant within 6 months because we were bunnies. We were just, you know, evangelical kids. So we then get preggo, and we're like, let's move back towards Oklahoma by our family. And I took a youth pastor job in Oklahoma. I was a youth pastor for 4 years, and then I started a band called the Brilliance with one of my best friends who was like an agnostic, that like, it's Christian, you know, he likes the Jesus message, but like he was definitely in the like college scene of like, I don't know, he had actually quit Christianity, like what your message would say. So then I was fully immersed in it while making music with him. And from there I started leading worship again at like larger places, and I took a job at like a mega church in Arizona that wanted to do like sacramental type things on like a Sunday night, and I was like, there's young, hip, sacramental worship leader, you know, that would help run that. But they were like Baptist at heart, so they really didn't want that, but they thought they did. And that pastor ended up having an affair. So from that point, I think I reached about 6 different people who were in ministry that you would be like, oh wow, they have now had an affair on some level. And at that point I was like, I think I'm done with working at churches, because the business of the evangelical church is a business. And I thought, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Do I wanna do like Brilliance, which would be like, I could do it full time, but do I really wanna do it full time? The answer would be no, for many reasons. One, it just is not that lucrative, and I have 4 children. We didn't ever want to be like a big band, and we evolved from like a worship type music to like peacemaking music, as you can hear right now, they're making noises. So from there, moved to New York City, because my wife and we were like, you know what? We want to live in a place that we actually want to live, not just go somewhere for a job. And I had a dear friend that had a church there, and it just fit exactly where we were at as far as the language that we would use as like kind of a post-evangelical. I've come out of the evangelical church, I understand that language. I am tired of the megachurch zone, at least working at it, and I would never attend one. And so this is actually a place that I have found many friends and community, and it's a place that I'm very grateful to be at. So it's Trinity Grace Church in New York. I'm sorry that that's so loud, you're probably gonna have to cut that.
That's all right. I want to hit on like through that journey of like pastor after pastor after pastor after pastor, like what's going on in you? Like what's going on in you? Like
I think my faith, like I probably went through the classic deconstruction of faith around like when I started working at another mega church, that second one in Arizona. I remember being in it's pretty loud. I remember going to a symphony, seeing this. Man, I got background music now. It's gonna be like an intense altar call. I remember going to a symphony, and what I felt in my heart, it was a deep tingling of doubt that actually was. It was a Russian composer that had to do a Russian like march. And so he brought in like Gershwin influences and all this Western influence to kind of like give a big middle finger to communism, and saying like, no, he really loved his country, loved Mother Russia. But it was kind of this thing of like, he had to do a march, he had to say this certain thing. And while he wrote one of his most famous symphonies while essentially in jail, under watch, because he couldn't be trusted. And I thought, man, this is me. Like everything that I say, not that I'm writing a symphony, but everything that I say, my language is like it's always watched, and I have to say the right thing of belief. I have to say the right thing as far as what's politically correct or whatever that looks like, because I work at a church, and so I felt a certain connectedness. And then I remember going that night and I had like a sacred meal with my wife and John, where I was talking about kind of my experience, and I was like, I don't know if I believe in God anymore. And my wife looked at me and she said, okay. And I remember it was like one of those sacred moments for my own life where I'm like, oh my gosh, she doesn't love me based on my belief. And so I just felt like the nakedness of my own soul, which I think, man, I'm about to give a biblical idea here. That's classic Genesis 3, wherever like when you're most vulnerable, you go hide in the trees. You're naked and you go hide in the trees. And I think for the trees for me, a lot of times was like Christian business or religious language. So like you're like, oh, I'm to be comfortable of like, oh, everything's cool. Look, I work at a church. Look, I say the right things. And it was just like, just hiding. And so being able to be honest about things then brought kind of a deconstructive phase to the reconstruction, came around traveling throughout the world and experiencing a lot of different worldviews and pains, different religions, those types of things were like, I think it brought back a real like Beatitudes message for me of like, what does it mean to be human? And I looked at like the life of Jesus and the life of like going back to my language of like as an evangelical of like we are made in the image of God and the idea of the incarnation. I then something was like a second form of life for my own spirituality, which was faith without shame. But even that faith, when you talk about it, is like it's still a language that I would be working out.
Right. Well, that's awesome. Cool. In terms of people maybe leaving westernized evangelical Christianity, do you feel like there's a safer place outside of the walls for actually being honest with your wrestlings, maybe your questions or doubts, or you feel like it's actually being brought back into the church?
I think in Western American Christianity, you can find doubters all over the place. Yeah. I think that's a healthy form or expression. As far as anytime you have faith, you have to have doubt. If you don't have doubt, you have a form of beliefism that is only based on certainty. Mm-hmm. And so there's no room for faith. So any church usually will have a place where hopefully you can be honest. And I feel like right now it's in vogue in a lot of Western places. I think the hard thing with that in American Christianity is for a lot of the places we don't know how to deal with doubt. So if you do talk about it, it's not talked about maybe from a stage, or it's not talked about in a way that like feels safe for people. Or if it does feel safe, it's like doubt to them. Once again, you have to believe. You have to believe. You have to believe. Sure. You have to believe. So like, yeah, it's cool that you do that, but you know that Jesus is really good. And so like, we don't actually have places for agnostic or atheist to be a part of church. Mm-hmm. And so I think one thing that draws me within my own community is we always try to have a moment of wherever you're at within this, there's space for you. Mm-hmm. And so this is a table that we all come to, that they don't even have to come to, but there's an open table, an open place for them. Now that's within my own small little traditional thing. Right. Meaning like I'm in New York, in a little corner in New York, where if I was talking about in the Midwest, it looks different because it's a different culture and a different expression. However, hopefully within that expression, hopefully there's still people that people can connect with and have dialogue with about their own doubts and fears. Because when they bring that into the light, that's usually where healing can take place. At least healing in the sense of you're not alone. So I feel like right now the weird thing about American Christian faith is expressed through beliefism. So it's like your personal decision, your personal like belief.
Sure.
And faith is not meant something that's just personal, it says communal. So oftentimes, because we make it so personal about belief, we also make our doubts so personal that it's like, I'm not going to actually share that I don't believe this story in the, like whatever it is, or I don't look at the world through the same lens that maybe my particular church community looks through the world. And I can feel like so isolating that then you create secrets because you're isolated and you feel like you have to deal with that isolation pain, that then you run to different types of vices or ways that you can kind of have a release valve.
Gotcha. Well, I have one last question.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about this in terms of Christianity and the language of Christianity. It's different from person to person. How have you felt like in your life that's evolved, and how like really what is Christianity to you? Like when you think of even the word, some people may say it's something that needs to be quit. Some people may say no, it's something to embrace. Some people may say it's something to fight for. In terms of you just personally.
So I don't feel like I can answer it personally because it's not mine. I would say, just let's go through the creed, and you'd be like, we believe in God, the Father, Creator, Almighty. Like the whole creed is like the expression of the church that gives a framework, at least for some language. But even then, you'd be like, well, right away we can start picking that apart. So for me, I'd be like, well, classic Christianity is going to be like, is it Trinitarian? Does it follow the creed? Is it actually, now that's Orthodox Christianity that I am like, have been splintered off of, right? Through like my evangelical post, I like still follow under that track for a language that we can use about Christianity. But my basis still for all of that is in like following Jesus Christ, that being like, okay, even when I say like following Jesus Christ, I'd be like, so what do you say when you mean Jesus? You'd be like, well, the language that I have in Christianity is like God made flesh. But even when I say God, then we can like break that down. And I'd be like, well, so what is God? Is it the substance of all things? Is it the ground of being? Is it the great abyss? Like, I'd be like, yeah, like that's it. Like to me, it's that cannot be named. And in that mystery, somehow it's expressed through a narrative that I find through Jesus Christ, that when I live out the teachings of Jesus, not that I live it out perfectly or right, but in trying to live that out, I find life that has a certain expression of this existence that we have that brings more meaning and more depth. Because even if my myths aren't true, or even if my myths are just these expressions or metaphors or whatever they are, that I have found that the idea of dying and resurrection is a powerful metaphor that actually plays out in real life, to where it's like, okay, how can I, through a sacramental lens, when I think everyone, I have these practices that we follow in the Christian faith. So I would say I'm very involved in like things like the liturgies that we use within the church, of trying to help curate those within our own church context. Those liturgies form me as a human being. So do I want to be this type of human being that is broken and poured out, like the Eucharist would say? Or do I want to be the type of human being that's just trying to cling to my own sense of power or own sense of survival? And I'm like, there's another expression to me that has brought great life, and that's following Jesus Christ. It's the expression of Christianity. But it's one that I think what's hard is that road is one of suffering, and that does not mean happiness. So if your goal is just to be like, I feel secure, I feel happy, American evangelicalism can give you, I think, a false sense of that. But for me to let that die, I've now experienced the road of suffering, which may just be an awareness of my own privilege, and then going, I've got to somehow be a person of reconciliation, at least trying to be a peacemaker. For me, if you were going to sum up, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ? I would say, well, the two high water marks are this. One, the ability to see. can I see the other person? Because when I see the other person, that's the only idea of what it means to see God. Because Jesus said, when you do this for the least of these, you do it for me. So when I'm seeing the person who is in pain, when I'm seeing their humanity, I'm seeing God. And the big irony is that oftentimes when I grew up as an evangelical, I thought, you do these things so that you're trying to help save them. But every time in Scripture, every parable, especially like the Good Samaritan, we think we're the Good Samaritan. No, we're the person in the ditch that needs saving. So when I go and I see someone, actually what that does is it doesn't empower them. It actually illuminates like my own sense of like, oh my gosh, I have been lost. I've not seen this person as a human being. So the ability to see and the ability to hear. And then, so what does that look like as far as our framework as evangelical Christians or post-evangelicals or Americans? I think with great privilege and great power comes great responsibility to then be able to give up that power and die to that power and then say, okay, how do I become a peacemaker? Because peacemaking is what discipleship looks like in the 21st century. Right. So the ability to see, to hear, to listen, to see one another's humanity and dignity, and moving from a culture of just shame and belief into one of hopefully curiosity, that what I could say mystery, that is actually curious and looking at that person and going, how can I learn from them? What can I say to them? As an evangelical growing up, I thought I had all the answers. I know what this is. So if it wasn't the person that fit in my box, then what do I have to learn from them? Right. I should teach them about the truth. The truth is Jesus. And this is like as stock Christian as I can get, but you're like, well, the truth isn't Jesus. Jesus is like the question of how to live life. So why do you do this? And you've heard it said this, and he kind of flips things upside down, is confusing, and it creates a lot of questions. And that deconstruction to then build on how then shall we live? That's what it means for me right now to be a follower of Christ, and I'm still asking that question. I don't know how to live. I with humility, hopefully trying to love. To love is all that we have. Like when you break all this stuff down, you're like, and what do we have left? Love remains. We have love.